They mocked the Duke's new bride for wearing the same worn gray gown to every single ball. The finest women in England came draped in silk and diamonds, in gowns that cost more than a laborer earned in a year. And the new Duchess of Harcourt came again and again and again, in one plain, unfashionable gray dress that had very clearly been made over more than once. The hem turned, the cuffs reset, the whole of it a season out of fashion and then another. They whispered that the Duke had married a pauper, that she shamed him, that she was too dull or too poor or too simple to know any better. And the Duke, who could have bought her 1,000 gowns with a stroke of his pen, said nothing at all, which only ever made them whisper louder. They were all so busy laughing at that worn gray dress that not one of them, in all those months, ever thought to ask the only question that actually mattered. Why that gown? Why always only that one? Because it had been her mother's, and sewn into the lining of it, hidden against Beatrice's own body, carried in plain sight through every ballroom in England, was the one thing her mother had died to protect. But someone in that ballroom knew. Someone had been searching for what was sewn into that gown for years, had already killed for it once, and had spent every one of those years watching the whole of London laugh at a worn gray dress, never once guessing that the thing they'd torn a house apart to find was hanging the entire time on the body of the woman they mocked. Stay with me. Because the day they finally stopped laughing at that gown was the day it destroyed them. To understand any of it, you have to understand the gown. And to understand the gown, you have to understand what it cost Beatrice to keep wearing it. But before we continue, if you're listening right now, help me prove something wrong. My wife said I wouldn't even reach 1,000 subscribers, but I believe stories like this deserve to be heard. Help me show her that tales like this truly matter. She was not, in fact, a pauper. That was the first thing they got wrong. She was a duchess now. She could have ordered silk from Lyon and had it made up by the finest modiste in London, and her husband would not have questioned a penny of it. She wore the gray gown anyway, on purpose, every time, and you have to understand what that meant for a woman in her world. A gown in that society was not a dress. It was a statement of your wealth, your taste, your husband's regard, your place in the order of things. To wear the same made-over gown to ball after ball was to stand in front of 300 of the most judgmental people in England and announce over and over, "I am beneath you." Laugh if you like. And they did like. Oh, they liked enormously. There was one woman in particular, Lady Sinclair, silver-tongued and diamond-hard, the unspoken queen of every drawing-room she entered, who had made a small art form of it, a word here, a look there, always just loud enough. The dear Duchess and her signature gown. A ripple of laughter behind fans. One does admire such consistency. Beatrice heard every word of it. She always heard. And she smiled her small, composed smile, and she said nothing. And she let them think exactly what they wished to think. Because here is what none of them understood about the woman in the worn gray gown. She was not enduring their mockery. She was using it. Every laugh at that dress was one more person who would look straight at the most valuable, most dangerous object in England, and see nothing but a poor woman's shame. Beatrice had not been broken by their cruelty. She had hidden inside it, and she had chosen, very deliberately, the one disguise that a room full of vain, cruel people would never in 1,000 years see through. She let them feel superior. Nobody examines a thing they've already decided is beneath them. Let me take you back 3 years to the night that made the gown what it was. Beatrice's mother, Lady Ashford, had not been a duchess or a great lady. She had been the widow of a country gentleman, clever and warm and quiet, living modestly with her only daughter in a house that was comfortable and unremarkable and entirely, it seemed, without secrets. And then, one autumn night, Lady Ashford came home from London changed. Beatrice never learned all of what happened there, only that her mother had gone to help settle the affairs of an old friend who had died, and had come back white and shaking and afraid in a way Beatrice had never once seen her be, her mother, who was afraid of nothing. That night, Lady Ashford did 3 strange things. She burned a great many papers in the kitchen fire. She sat up until dawn with her sewing box, and near morning she came into Beatrice's room and woke her and pressed the gray gown into her arms, her own second-best gown, plain and unremarkable, and folded her daughter's hands over it and said the words Beatrice would carry for the rest of her life. "There is something sewn into the lining. Do not take it out. Do not show it to a soul, not a magistrate, not a friend, not the man you marry, no one. The moment anyone knows you have it, you are in the danger I am in now." Her mother's hands had been shaking. "Wear it, Beatrice. Wear it plain. Wear it often. Wear it until they stop seeing it. The safest place in the world to hide a thing is somewhere too humble for anyone to look. Promise me," Beatrice promised. 3 days later, her mother was dead. A sudden illness, the physician said. A weakness of the heart, very sad, very quick, nothing anyone could have done. Beatrice did not believe it for one single moment, but she was 20 years old, and alone, and had no proof of anything. Only a gray gown, and a promise, and a fear she could tell to no one. So she did the only thing she could do. She kept the promise. She wore the gown. Think about the weight of that. 20 years old, her mother 3 days in the ground, and Beatrice understood, the way you understand things in your bones before you can prove them, that her mother had been murdered for whatever was sewn into that lining, and that if she breathed one word of it, she'd be next. So she told no one. She grieved alone, she guarded the secret alone, and she wore that gown like armor for 3 long years, letting the whole world believe she was simply a poor, plain, unremarkable girl. It was the loneliest kind of courage there is, and it was about to collide with a duke. Now, how does a plain, poor, unremarkable girl come to be the Duchess of Harcourt? That was the second thing everyone got wrong. They assumed the duke had married down out of scandal, or debt, or some flaw in him that made the great matches impossible. Why else would a man of his rank choose a nobody in a made-over gown? The truth was stranger, and Beatrice herself did not understand it for a long while. The Duke of Harcourt, Adrian, had known her mother, not well, but the old friend whose affairs Lady Ashford had gone to London to settle, that fatal autumn, that friend had been the Duke's uncle, and the Duke had spent 3 years since quietly certain of 2 things he could prove to nobody: that his uncle had not died of natural causes, and that Lady Ashford had found something among the dead man's papers that had gotten her killed too. He had not been able to find it. He had looked, carefully, quietly, for 3 years, and every trail had gone cold until the only lead left in all the world was a grieving country daughter who had vanished into obscurity and poverty. So the Duke of Harcourt did the only thing he could think of to get close to the last person who might know what his uncle had died for. He courted her, and he married her. Not for love, not at first. He married her the way you follow your last remaining clue. And he watched, and he waited, and he tried to work out whether the quiet, composed, unreadable woman he'd married knew anything at all, never once guessing that the thing they were both circling was sewn into the very gown she wore to their wedding. If your pulse just picked up, if you've realized that the Duke and his bride are each guarding half of the same deadly secret, and neither one knows the other is doing it, then you already understand what this channel is about. The quiet ones, the overlooked ones, the people carrying something enormous behind a face the world has decided not to look at. That's every story I tell here. Subscribe and stay with me, because the moment these 2 secrets meet is the moment everything catches fire. So there they were, married and strangers, and each of them sitting on half of the same buried thing. The Duke watched his wife. He noticed things, that she was far cleverer than she let anyone see, that she missed nothing in a room, that for a woman supposedly humbled by poverty, she carried herself with a strange, unbreakable steadiness. He noticed that she wore that gray gown with a deliberateness that made no sense for simple want of money, and he could not, for the life of him, work out what she was. And Beatrice watched her husband right back. She had not survived 3 years by trusting easily. She saw that he was kind, and that his kindness had a purpose under it she couldn't name. She saw the way his eyes moved over her things, her rooms, her past, searching for something. She did not know what, but she knew a searcher when she saw one, because she had spent 3 years being hunted. So they circled, each certain the other was hiding something, neither able to say what. And the whole time, at every ball, Lady Sinclair and her set laughed at the gray gown, and the Duke, who did not understand why his wife clung to that dress, watched them do it and felt a slow, surprising anger on her behalf, that had nothing to do with his uncle at all, and this is the quiet thing happening underneath the mystery, the thing that turns a hunt into a love story. The Duke married Beatrice as a clue, but you cannot watch a person be mocked, week after week, and watch them absorb it with that much silent dignity, and go on thinking of them as a clue. Somewhere in those months, without meaning to, without noticing he was doing it, the Duke of Harcourt stopped watching his wife like an investigator, and started watching her like a man who could not look away. It broke open in the end, the way these things do, by accident and all at once. There was a ball, a grand one, and Lady Sinclair, perhaps bored, perhaps emboldened, took her cruelty one step further than usual. As Beatrice passed, Lady Sinclair, with a bright, poisonous smile and a glass of wine held just so, turned and let the wine go, all down the front of the gray gown. "Oh, how clumsy of me," she said, to a ripple of laughter. "But no matter. It's hardly as though the dress could be spoiled, is it?" And the room laughed, and Beatrice, for one single second, one flash before she caught herself, went absolutely white with a terror that had nothing to do with a ruined dress, because a wet gown is a gown that must be taken off, cleaned, handled by servants, examined. The Duke saw that flash of terror. He had spent 3 years learning to read exactly that kind of fear, and he understood, in that instant, that his wife was not afraid of embarrassment. She was afraid of the dress. He got her out of there, made some smooth excuse, took her arm, walked her out to the cold, empty terrace, and there, in the dark, with the wine soaking through the gray wool, he looked at her white face and said the thing that ended 3 years of her silence. "Beatrice, what is sewn into that gown?" Watch what that question does to her. For 3 years, Beatrice has guarded this alone. Her mother told her to trust no one, not a magistrate, not a friend, not the man she married, no one. And now the man she married is standing in front of her, having guessed the one secret she has kept from the entire world, and every instinct 3 years in the making is screaming at her to deny it, to run, to protect the secret with a lie. And underneath that, some newer, more dangerous instinct is whispering that she is so tired of being alone with it. She didn't answer him, not at first. She stood on that terrace in her wine-soaked gown and stared at the man who shouldn't have known. And she said, very carefully, "Why would you ask me that?" And the Duke of Harcourt made a choice of his own. He decided to go first. "Because 3 years ago," he said quietly, "my uncle died. Everyone said his heart gave out. I never believed it. And the last person to see his papers, the last person he trusted to help settle his affairs, was a country widow named Lady Ashford." He watched her face. "Who died herself 3 days later, suddenly, of a weakness of the heart." Beatrice stopped breathing. "I have been looking for 3 years," the Duke said, "for whatever my uncle knew that was worth killing 2 people to bury. Every trail went cold. You were the last one left." His voice dropped. "I married you to get close to it, Beatrice. I'll not lie to you about that, not now, but I have to ask you," and here his composure finally cracked, "was Lady Ashford your mother?" "She was," Beatrice whispered, and 3 years of silence broke open on a cold terrace between 2 people who had each, alone, been carrying one half of the same murdered truth. "So, there it is. Mystery. A answered. She wears the gown because her mother sewed something into the lining and died for it. The Duke married her hunting the very same secret. 2 halves finally met, which should crack the whole thing wide open. Except for the one question neither of them can yet answer, the question that is going to pull you all the way to the end. They know what was hidden and why it was hidden. They still don't know the only thing that matters. Who? Who killed his uncle? Who killed her mother? Who has spent 3 years searching for that gown, and is, at this very moment, somewhere in that ballroom behind them, laughing. Stay with me. They opened it that night, together, door locked, candle lit, Beatrice's mother's scissors to the lining of the gray gown for the first time in 3 years. And there it was, flat and folded and sewn so carefully you'd never feel it through the wool. A letter and a record in a dead man's careful hand. The Duke's uncle had uncovered a theft. A charitable trust, a fortune meant for the relief of the poor, had been quietly drained for years by a prominent family, the accounts forged to hide it. The uncle had gathered the whole proof, the false figures beside the true ones, and a letter naming exactly who was behind it. He'd confided in one friend to keep it safe while he prepared to act, Lady Ashford. And for that, they'd killed them both, and the proof had vanished into a grieving girl's gown and been laughed at by all of London for 3 years. Beatrice read the name in the letter, and her hands began to shake, because she knew it. She'd been hearing it for months, dripping from the most elegant lips in every drawing room in England. The family that had murdered 2 people and robbed the poor to gild themselves wasn't some distant shadow. It was the family whose queen had led the laughter at her gown, week after week, never once dreaming that the thing they'd killed for was hanging on the body of the woman they mocked, close enough to touch. Sit with the horror of that for a second. For 3 years, Beatrice guarded this in the dark, never knowing who her enemy was, and she'd found them without knowing it, been curtsying to them, absorbing their cruelty, wearing the proof of their crimes into their own ballrooms for a year. Lady Sinclair. The proof was in the room every time she laughed. Knowing the name was not the same as being able to use it. Lady Sinclair sat at the heart of a family that was powerful, rich, and beloved. A murdered widow's daughter in a made-over gown, accusing the queen of society of theft and murder, would be laughed out of England, or quietly killed, the way her mother was, before anyone believed a word. "We can't simply produce it," Beatrice told the Duke, thinking fast and cold now, 3 years of caution turned to purpose. "A letter can be called a forgery. My mother, a bitter dying woman, me, a fortune hunter, who married up and invented a scandal. If we bring this out clumsily, they'll do to us exactly what they did to them." She shook her head. "We need more than the proof. We need to catch them reaching for it." "How?" And Beatrice, who knew better than anyone alive how little these people guarded themselves around someone they had written off, smiled her small, cold smile. "They've spent 3 years looking for this gown," she said. "They just don't know they've found it. So, let's tell them. Do you see the turn? For 3 years, Beatrice hid. Now she's going to do the opposite. She's going to let the killers find out that the thing they've hunted for 3 years exists, and is real, and is about to surface. And then she's going to be watching, very carefully, to see who moves. Because the guilty don't stay calm when the thing that can hang them comes back from the dead. The mocked, invisible woman in the gray gown is about to set a trap using the one thing she has that they don't. They still don't take her seriously. And that is exactly the mistake that's going to end them. But Beatrice, being Beatrice, saw one more thing. The thing that turned this from revenge into something she could live with afterward. The stolen fortune, the charitable trust. She kept coming back to it in the uncle's careful figures, a fund meant for the relief of the poor, drained for years to buy the silk and diamonds and grand houses of the very people who'd laughed at her gown. Every cruel, glittering thing Lady Sinclair had ever worn while mocking a poor woman's dress had been bought with money stolen from the poor. It was almost too neat. The woman who sneered at Beatrice for looking impoverished had built her entire shining life on robbing the impoverished blind. "It isn't only proof of a murder," Beatrice said quietly, turning the papers in the candlelight. "It's proof of what they stole, and who they stole it from." She looked up at her husband. "If we do this right, we don't just hang them for the killing, we give it back, all of it, to the people it was taken from." Something settled in her face. "My mother didn't die to win me a fortune, Adrian. She died guarding proof that was meant to help thousands of people who never had a voice. I'm not going to spend it on revenge and stop there. I'm going to finish what she was killed for. And that's why she's the heroine, and not merely the survivor." The easy version of this story ends with Beatrice exposing Lady Sinclair, taking her fortune, and walking off in silks of her own. But Beatrice looks at a fortune stolen from the poor and does not see her payday. She sees her mother's actual unfinished purpose. The gown was never about her. It was about everyone the powerful had decided didn't matter, which, of course, is exactly the category they'd put Beatrice in too. She's not going to win by joining them. She's going to win by finishing the thing they killed to stop. They said it carefully, the Duke's resources behind Beatrice's 3 years of cunning. The Duke let it be known, quietly, in the right ears, the ones that fed back to Lady Sinclair, that his late uncle's lost papers had surfaced at last. that a record had been found among the old man's effects, thought destroyed, now in the Duke's own keeping, and that he meant to bring a matter of great scandal before the magistrates within the week. He did not say what it named, he didn't have to. Only the guilty would know precisely what those papers threatened, and only the guilty would be unable to stop themselves from moving to destroy them before that week was out. And then Beatrice and the Duke waited to see who came in, the night. They came, of course. Lady Sinclair could not do it herself, but she sent her people, sent them to break into the Duke's study and burn what was kept there, exactly as 3 years ago she had sent people to silence an old man and a country widow. And the Duke's men were waiting and took them, and the men, faced with a hanging for burglary or a lesser fate for the truth, gave up the name of the woman who'd sent them without a moment's loyalty. But Beatrice wanted more than hired men. She wanted Lady Sinclair herself, in front of everyone, with no way out. So she chose the ground, Lady Sinclair's own grand ball, the glittering centerpiece of the season, the very kind of room where the gray gown had been mocked 100 times, 3 years of being laughed at in ballrooms. And Beatrice arranged it so that the reckoning would fall in the grandest ballroom of them all, Lady Sinclair's own, in the exact place, in front of the exact people, where she had been humiliated over and over. If you are going to stop being the joke of the room, do it in the room that laughed loudest. She wore the gray gown. Of course she did. One last time. Lady Sinclair's ball was at its glittering height when the Duchess of Harcourt walked in, wearing the made-over gray dress the whole of London had laughed at for a year. And a ripple of the old amusement went round the room. She's worn it again, can you believe it? And Lady Sinclair, radiant and cruel at the center of her own triumph, raised her glass and her voice. Your Grace, you honor us, and in your famous gown, no less. Laughter. One does wonder if it's the only one you own. It's the only one that matters, Beatrice said. And the room, sensing something in her voice, began to quiet. You've laughed at this gown for a year, my lady, Beatrice said, walking slowly into the center of the floor. All of you have. A poor, plain dress, made over one too many times. You decided what it was the moment you saw it, and you never looked again. She reached to the lining at her side, where the careful stitches had been opened and the papers restored, and she drew them out. Which is a great pity for you, because for 3 years you have been searching for exactly this, and it has been hanging on my body in this room every single time you laughed. Lady Sinclair's glass had gone very still in her hand. My mother sewed these into this gown the night before your people killed her, Beatrice said, and her voice did not shake. Just as they killed the Duke's uncle 3 days before, for the crime of knowing what you are. She lifted the papers so the room could see. A charitable trust for the relief of the poor, robbed for years by your family, forged accounts, a stolen fortune, every diamond you're wearing tonight bought with money taken from people who had nothing. My mother died guarding the proof. Your people came to burn it 4 nights ago. They're in custody now, and they've given your name freely. She turned, unhurried, to the 2 grave gentlemen who had come in quietly behind her. The magistrates have the ledgers, and the trust is going to be repaid, every stolen penny, to the people you took it from. The silence in that ballroom was the silence of 300 people watching a queen turn, in the space of a minute, into a criminal. Every laugh she ever let land, every time she wore that gown into a room and smiled through the cruelty. She was building this. The invisibility they forced on her, the contempt they never bothered to hide, the years they spent looking straight at the proof of their crimes and seeing only a poor woman's shame. All of it was the trap. Lady Sinclair didn't lose because Beatrice was lucky. She lost because she was so certain the woman in the worn gown didn't matter that she laughed at the evidence for a year. It came apart for Lady Sinclair and her family the way these things do when the proof is finally undeniable, all at once, and completely. The hired men's confessions, the uncle's meticulous ledgers, Lady Ashford's letter, the forged accounts set beside the true ones. It was far past anything a clever lawyer or a great name could explain away. The family was ruined and prosecuted. Lady Sinclair, who had sent others to kill and burn on her behalf, did not escape the weight of it. The great shining house came down, and the diamonds with it, and the stolen fortune, this was the part Beatrice cared about most, was returned. every recoverable penny of it restored to the charitable trust, to do at last the thing it had been meant to do, relieve the poor that Lady Sinclair had spent years robbing to gild herself. The country widow's daughter, whom all of London had laughed at, had finished the work her mother was murdered for. And London, which had spent a year mocking a worn gray gown, learned the whole truth over the following weeks, the way such places always do, and found that it could no longer quite meet the Duchess of Harcourt's eye. The Duke found her, the night it was finally over, sitting quietly with the gray gown across her lap. She was not crying, she was just holding it, the turned hem, the reset cuffs, the opened lining, the thing that had been her armor and her burden and her mother's last gift, all at once, for 3 long years. "You don't have to wear it anymore," Adrian said gently, sitting beside her. "It's done. You could put it away. Burn it if you liked. You never have to walk into another room in it again." "I know." Beatrice ran her thumb along the worn wool. "That's the strange thing. For 3 years I hated it. It was the weight I carried, the thing I could never set down." She was quiet a moment. "And now that I could set it down, I find I don't want to." She sewed her whole courage into this thing, Adrian. She sat up all night, terrified, and she thought of the one place they'd never look, and she was right. She protected all those people, and me, with a needle and a plain gray dress. Her voice caught. "It's the bravest thing I've ever held." The Duke was quiet for a moment. Then, "I married you as a clue," he said. "I've never been sorrier for anything, or gladder of anything in my life. I don't want the woman who solved my uncle's murder, Beatrice. I stopped wanting that months ago." He took her hand over the gray wool. "I want the woman who wore her mother's courage into a room full of people who laughed at her, and never once let them see her flinch. I have watched you do the bravest thing I've ever seen a person do, quietly, for a year. I don't want a clue. I want you." Beatrice looked at him, really looked the way she'd been afraid to for months, and found that the searcher was gone from his eyes and had been for a long time, and what was left was just a man who saw her. "Then I'll keep the gown," she said, and smiled. "But I think I should like a new one too, for the days that aren't about surviving." She laced her fingers through his. "You may buy me exactly one." "One," said the Duke of Harcourt gravely, and kissed her hand. "I'll ruin us. So, here's what I want you to carry with you tonight." For a year, everyone who looked at Beatrice saw a poor, plain, faintly embarrassing woman in a worn-out gown. They were so certain. They decided what she was in a single glance and never troubled to look again. And that certainty, that lazy contempt, was the exact thing that blinded them to the proof of their own crimes hanging in plain sight. That's the thing about writing people off. When you decide someone doesn't matter, you stop seeing them, and you have no idea what you're failing to see. Beatrice hid the most dangerous secret in England in the one place no proud, cruel person would ever look, behind their own contempt. And underneath that worn gray wool was a woman carrying her murdered mother's last courage, alone, in silence, for 3 years, letting a whole city laugh at her rather than risk the thing she'd been trusted to protect. The bravest people you will ever meet are so rarely the ones in the diamonds. They're so often the quiet one at the edge of the room, in the plain dress, that everyone's already decided not to look at. So the next time a room laughs at someone, the poor one, the plain one, the one who doesn't glitter, be the one who looks twice. Ask what they might be carrying that you can't see. Because contempt is the easiest thing in the world to hide behind, and the people we underestimate are so often the ones holding everything up. Sometimes the most valuable thing in the room is the one nobody will look at. And sometimes it's wearing a worn gray gown and smiling and waiting. If Beatrice got under your skin tonight, if you believe the overlooked ones, the quiet ones, the people the world laughs at without ever looking twice deserve, in the end, to be seen, then you're my kind of person, and this is your channel. Subscribe and turn the bell on, so the next story always finds you. And tell me in the comments, did you guess what was sewn into the gown before the Duke asked? And would you have kept your mother's promise for 3 years, alone, the way Beatrice did? I read every single one.